Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. I have read almost all of Don DeLillo's novels. I am just missing two of them. And the one that I enjoyed the most, just at the level of the pure pleasure of reading, is Mao 2. I have always felt weird about that, like that is a strange choice or something. So for many years I've been wanting to reread it to see if I could figure out why it was that this novel resonated so much with me. So I reread it and I think I figured it out. So that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this video. But you know, a couple of years ago I was at a library and I saw one of those really nice volumes of the Library of America. And I pulled it and I realized that it brought together Underworld and Mao 2. So I was like, well, I was not that wrong, apparently. This is considered to be an important novel. So let's explore it together. Let me tell you a little bit about it and about how I feel about this great novel. Mao 2 was published in the year 1991, which, as you may know, was a wonderful year for music, but that's another story. And it is Don DeLillo's 10th or 11th novel, if you count Amazon's, as I think we should. It is right between Underworld on the one hand and Libra. Libra came first, then Mao 2, then Underworld. I switched around my hands right there. In many ways, it is closely related to White Noise, mainly because of the themes that are being treated in this book. For example, mass culture, for example, the media, the spectacle, or we could even say the society of the spectacle. But here's the thing, Mao 2 is a little bit more specific because it deals, one of its main themes is the effects of television, the effects of the news on literature, and more focused on the figure of the author. So these are just wonderful themes that we have at work right here. It has a lovely structure. Let me tell you about it. Basically what we have is two parts, but they are also put in a kind of a frame here by an opening section and a closing section. And very interestingly, you're going to see that the novel begins and ends with a wedding ceremony. So very different ones, contrasted ones, of course, but you know, that may sound a little bit Jane Austen to you, the wedding ceremony at the end, but it's not like that. Now, what we have here, once again, is two parts, but then we have those bookends right there. And the novel takes us from New York to Beirut. So we also have quite a span right there, geographically speaking. So let's talk about the plot and also about the characters, of course, as we do that. The novel is set on a very specific time. It is set in the spring and the summer of 1989. So this is not one of those novels that could have taken place at any time. This is deliberate. And then the closing section that I was telling you about takes us a little bit into the future. It's like 1 year after the events of the conclusion of the second part. 1989, we have to think, for example, about some key events like the Tiananmen Square protests, the death of the Ayatollah Khomeini, the Rushdie affair. So keep those in mind because all of those are very important to the plot and also to the themes that are being discussed here. So the opening section, what we have here is our first character whom we meet during a mass marriage ceremony of the Unification Church. The Unification Church, commonly known as the Moonies. So this is Karen, the first character that we meet. And then when we get to part one, the opening section and the closing section are very brief. We meet her again. And this first part also introduces to us the three other main characters that we're going to meet in this story, because this is mainly a story about a quartet. So we have Karen, then we have the reclusive author Bill Gray, Scott, who is his assistant, and then we also have a woman named Britta Nielsen. She is a photographer who has come to do a photo shoot with Bill Gray after many, many years that he has been photographed for the last time. So who is Karen in this whole thing? Well, Karen is also an assistant of Bill, and also she helps Scott in more ways than one, because she also happens to be the lover of both of them. Part one takes place mostly in Bill's residence, in his house, and we also hear many, many conversations between these four characters about things like art, like literature, the media, photography, violence, reclusiveness, and many other topics. This is a Don DeLillo novel after all, so you can expect it to be, or to rely heavily, I would say, on dialogue. The action, the conflict begins when Rita tells Bill that his editor, Charlie, wants to talk to him. So what does Charlie want? Well, for one, he wants Bill's next novel, which he has been working on for many, many years, as any editor would. But he also tells Bill that there is a little-known Swiss poet who has been held hostage in Beirut. He is there at the moment, and Charlie wants Bill to be the one who rescues him or who gets him out of that tight spot. In other words, what Charlie wants is to resurrect this figure of the author, the reclusive author, the author who does not want to be seen in all his glory. We're talking about maybe the death of the author here, but also the resurrection, because that means the right kind of publicity, I would say, the great type of publicity that he is looking for, the spectacle, which of course also means money. So that is part one. Then when we come to part two, we see Bill and Charlie in Europe as they're moving closer to their objective, which is to reach this poet, this Swiss poet who is being held hostage. And there in Europe, they meet another important character by the name of George Haddad. George Haddad is an academic, but he has ties to the people who are holding this Swiss poet hostage. In other words, he's a kind of liaison between academia and terror, if you will. It's a very strange and very interesting situation that Don DeLillo conveys right here with this novel. And finally, in the closing section, we meet Brita again. She is in Beirut, but she is not taking pictures of authors or writers anymore. Now she takes pictures of terrorist leaders. So you see how the figure of the author has been displaced. That is what the novel tries to convey in terms of a message right here. Let's look at some themes, shall we? I think this is maybe the best way to approach a Don DeLillo novel versus, approaching it through the quote-unquote plot. The first theme that I wanted to explore with you is that of the role of the author in the late 20th century, or we could say even in postmodern times. So we have at the center of this novel the figure of a reclusive author that is definitely going to make you think of Salinger, for example. And as a matter of fact, Don DeLillo said that Salinger, the figure of Salinger, was an inspiration for this novel. You may also think, of course, of Thomas Pynchon. And as a matter of fact, Pynchon liked this novel very much, which is not surprising. He said, "This novel is a beauty, a vision as bold, and the voice as eloquent and morally focused as any in American writing." But the novel proper, after the opening sequence, also begins in a bookstore where Scott is browsing the bookshelves, looking at how the books are displayed, all that type of stuff. So you can get wonderful descriptions here of the book covers, the way that they are sold, almost kind of a fetishism of books. In other words, what we have is the book as a commodity, right? The book is something that can be sold, the book as a sort as a source of profit, really. We have a contrast going on, if you think about it, between a larger-than-life public figure, in this case one example, and the one central to the book would be Mao, right, versus the author who does not want to be seen, in this case the figure of Bill Gray. And I think, one of the things that I was pondering about when I read this was how the author, the writer, used to be a public figure. I'm going to give you a very specific example here. I don't know if it applies, but this is what I was thinking, maybe because of where I come from. The boom writers of the Latin American boom, people like Carlos Fuentes, right? People like Cortázar, even a little bit before that, I think of Borges, I think of Ernesto Sábato, because I'm, from Argentina, as you may know. But now that writer has been displaced. The writer simply does not have the same stature, I would say, that he or she had in previous times. And I'm going to read you a little part here, a little passage, just to share also with you the kind of style that you may find in this novel. This is on page 41. "Years ago, I used to think it was possible for a novelist to alter the inner life of the culture." And I'm jumping a little here to 42. "We're giving way to terror, to news of terror, to tape recorders and cameras, to radios, to bombs stashed in radios. News of disaster is the only narrative people need. The darker the news, the grander the narrative." So the idea that the author is being displaced by the news, by the media. And one of the reasons why an author may choose to become reclusive, not to show him or herself, maybe, and in this case it is of the novel with Bill Gray, the idea that he, in this case, acquires mythical proportions. To publish would be to break the myth. Imagine if Salinger had published a book at the height of his seclusion, to put it that way. And at another point here, and this is Bill speaking, he says, nature has given way to aura, the aura being that myth that I was telling you about. And just above that it says, nothing happens until it's consumed. So you can see a lot here of the kind of material that was being explored in White Noise that comes back, but specifically when talking about authors, when talking about literature. The second theme that I wanted to explore is the relationship between word and image. Very interestingly, Mao Tzu contrasts two figures, the figure of the writer and the figure of the photographer. We have Bill and we have Brita, who is photographing him. So this novel even incorporates images into the text, which is also very interesting. You can see it from the very beginning in the title page right here, and also every time that we look at a different section, we have a picture right there, a photograph in the background. I don't know if you can see that here in the camera, but the novel is in dialogue with these images that appear in the novel itself. And I think here the image could be seen as a threat to the word, but at the end of the day, both of them, the image and the word, are symbols, right? And you can even see in the novel a discussion of what we could call the banalization of the image. The title itself points that out, Mao Tzu. We're going to talk about the title specifically in a few minutes. But Mao Tzu, the idea that what we have here is a reproduction, right? It's a repetition, as in the art of Andy Warhol. That is another thing that we're going to explore soon. But also the commercialization of the image. I think that would be the next step. You know, we are used to thinking that an image is worth 1,000 words, but then you have the banalization of the image and then the commercialization of the image. Textbook example of this, I would say, this is not as common these days, but it used to be, at least when I was younger. I never wore one of these, just for the record. Remember those Che Guevara t-shirts, right? That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. I remember seeing an interview with Fidel Castro at one point, and somebody asked him about that. What would Che think about the fact that people have backpacks or t-shirts with his face on it? And I think Fidel Castro said, oh, he would probably laugh about it. We can take that any way we want, but that is something that is also a concern of this novel. Third theme that we want to look at, the language of art and the language of violence. You're going to notice towards the end of the novel, most obviously in the closing section, that the language of art and the language of violence become almost interchangeable. Brita is taking pictures of this terrorist leader, right? And this is what in English we would call a photo shoot, right? So she shoots pictures. She reloads the camera as a person might shoot or reload a weapon. This is the type of linguistic irony that Don DeLillo loves. Remember Endzone, his second novel, where you had the language of football and the language of war sort of converging? That's the kind of thing that we also see here. A little bit of it, at least, in Mao Tzu, in terms of the relationship between art and violence. And finally, the fourth theme that I have for you is herd mentality and individualism. I like to look at these things sometimes in terms of dichotomies. Another concern of this novel is the concept and the reality of the crowd. Okay, the crowd. There's an important statement that closes that opening sequence right here, and this is one of the key statements of the novel. The future belongs to crowds. I could not help thinking of the book by Elias Canetti, Crowds and Power, obviously, right? This idea that, you know, you find some kind of consolation in the crowd. And the novel, very importantly, begins with a crowd, begins with a procession, just as White Noise did. It's a different kind of procession. Here you have a mass marriage. In White Noise you had the students arriving to the campus, where the main character was a teacher. We are witnessing here the glorification, I would say, of herd mentality and the end of individualism, which is a truly American value. And why does this happen? Well, the novel offers many clues. There's one of them that I remember on page 7. They're talking about this ceremony of the Unification Church and the Master, as they call him. He answers their yearning, unburdens them of free will and independent thought. See how happy they look. The crowd, of course. So when independent thought, when free will are perceived as burdens, the crowd allows for that escape from all that. Maybe you could even say that escape from freedom, as that title of that great book by Erich Fromm goes, which is, by the way, you know, a book that has a lot in common with this novel. It's a book that can help us to understand this novel and to get more out of it. Let's talk about the title. Very intriguing title right here, you know. And I was thinking, just imagine giving this novel, Mao Tu, to somebody as a gift, and they tell you, thank you so much, but that's not going to work because I haven't read the first part, you know. Or, I don't know, you're reading this and, you know, somebody tells you, is it as good as the first part? But it's a really interesting title. It really grabbed my attention. It's intriguing. And you have seen, of course, Andy Warhol's Cans of Soup, right? His images also of Marilyn Monroe, one after the other. This is what we have here. Mao Tu is one of a series. And I could not help thinking, as I was, you know, pondering on this topic, of Walter Benjamin's famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. There's a concept right there that is central to that essay, which is the concept of the aura. The concept of the aura is explicitly mentioned in this novel. Aura is what the original work of art has, what the original Mona Lisa has when you see the painting at the Louvre. Every reproduction is just another, you know, version of it. It does not have that aura. So Mao Tu, that too is the point at which the aura is lost, basically, if you think about it that way. It is the first reproduction. And there's always going to be a next one, right? That is the implication right here. Question, what iPhone are we on right now? You know what I'm saying, right? I don't even know, because I don't have an iPhone. I wouldn't even have a cell phone if I could, but you know, I have to have one because otherwise my mother would worry too much about me. So as a bottom line, what I wanted to do is I wanted to share with you some thoughts on why I found this novel to be so good and why it kind of stands out. Why is it my favorite? What we get here is Don DeLillo exploring life in the postmodern world. In other words, he is doing here what he does best, but with a very special focus. He is talking about literature. He is talking about the figure of the writer. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I like this novel so much. Not only is he exploring life in the postmodern world, but he is doing it talking about the thing itself, if you ask me. So it's just wonderful. And another thing that I was thinking, you know, also related to this, is that Mao Tu is actually truly relevant still after all of these years since it was published in 1991. The preoccupation here in the novel was that the news, the media, could displace the figure of the author. Imagine now with the internet, with social media, with AI, right? So we're adding more layers to this whole issue right here. Question for you, if anybody knows about this, do some publishing contracts sort of include or require the author to have an online presence? I can tell you at one point in Latin America they did. The author was quote-unquote required, or I guess not quote-unquote, I mean it's a contract, right? Part of the contract was that the author would have a blog or something like that. There would be, you know, an online presence. So think about that in the context of the time when certain authors at least could decide, oh, I'm just going to be a reclusive author. I'm not going to allow for my picture to be taken and stuff like that. It's just a very, very different context. Let me say this before I conclude this video. If you have read Don DeLillo and you have not read this one, please give it a chance. Okay, this is one of his most important novels. But if you have not read Don DeLillo, if you're new to him, I would say probably read White Noise first. Okay, and I'm a fine one to say this because I'm gonna tell you, White Noise was my introduction to the works of Don DeLillo, and I did not like it. Okay, I did a video on it in Spanish recently, and I said that too. But I think I had to read and dislike White Noise in order for me to enjoy Mao Tu. And then of course I had to read Mao Tu in order to enjoy White Noise when I reread it. It's a very interesting thing. So, do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? You know that I'm always happy to hear them, especially about a novel like this one, because I really enjoyed reading it and rereading it. Those were my 2 cents on Mao Tu by Don DeLillo. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.